as we get into the subject, to make sure that our terms are clear. So when I'm talking about evil, we know what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about demons, we know what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, this is a great difficulty when we talk about spiritual subjects. If I say I believe in God, for example, that might mean different things to different people. Levi said very famously that you ask an atheist to define God, and what they define is usually something that doesn't exist. And when you ask someone who believes in God to define God, well, they define something that it seems to necessarily exist. And you realize these two people, what this person doesn't believe and what this person does believe, are not even connected remotely. So it's an issue of discrepancy in the description or the definition of the words that they're using, less so than the ideology per se. And this is a big deal, because if we're going to go with this notion, I keep hammering this in, evil is error, there is this gap, and language is one of the fundamental ways that comes out, because there is a gap in between the symbol and the thing that is being symbolized. And if that is an authentic relationship, then we have meaningful communication. If it's not an authentic relationship, or if there's some confusion about the terms and definitions, then there's that gap which allows for error. And that's kind of how these things work. And these entities manifest their wills and intents, I should say. The reason that this is especially interesting and especially important for ceremonial magicians is because that relationship in between symbol and thing symbolized is sort of the fundamental idea behind ceremonial magic. I mean, this is what Aleister Crowley talks about when he describes the magical link in Book 4. The idea that we can manipulate objects, perform gestures, say words over here, and initiate a chain of events over here that's going to have a particular intended result described here. Well, we've got a symbol and the thing symbolized. Either they have an authentic relationship or they don't. If they don't, then your magic doesn't work because you don't have that link properly established. Whereas if that link is established, then even a crude ritual which doesn't adhere to sort of a higher ceremonial standards has a pretty good chance of having an effect. A much better chance than a fully formal ritual where it lacks that link in between the result and the actual working itself. And in Goetic magic, this is interesting because the spirits themselves tend to be our magical link. Every now and then, a spirit will want you to do something, like if you're trying to do a working on someone, you might want to get a piece of something that belongs to them or something like that. I mean, these are all kind of basic connection stuff. But the way Crowley describes it when we're working with evocation is, we're kind of going to the spirit and saying, hey, help me out. Can you do this for me? Which is very different, he explains, than doing a ceremonial magical ritual and just having the effect. Which is why I think that the Goetia is interesting to look at. People have different points of view about this system. There's a great deal of what I would consider to be nonsense talked about it. I don't like to totally whitewash it and say, because there are people who will tell you, it's dangerous, look out for these entities, blah, 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 and I think that they're kind of crazy. And there are people that tell you, oh, it's totally safe, don't worry about it, these guys are your friends, and I think they're crazy too. It's a balance that has to be struck. I don't think personally Goetic spirits are malicious per se, but just because their nature is to fuck shit up if they're out of control or in the wrong place at the wrong time, they're happy to do that. And they certainly want to hang around, which is interesting. If we look at Crowley doing the 10th Aether in the Vision of the Voice, he talks a lot about the nature of Sharanzan, who's kind of the root of those four devils that he describes. And really he says that the only thing to do is to treat it with silence, not to interact too much. Which is interesting. When I first got into the Goetian, I wasn't too experienced with these entities or dealing with these kind of things. I was just so pleased to see something show up. And it's like, oh, it's cool, you're here. And then you're telling me all these stories and going on. And then it would turn into these long, very draining, protracted rituals, and I realized that I wasn't getting very much out of it other than demon story time, which is fun for a little while, but you have to have a direct thing that you want to do. But they love that. They love to just kind of hang around in the world. They want as much access as they can, which is why I think it's interesting when I hear people try to characterize these entities as somehow malicious or terrifying or aggressive, which has never been my experience with them. They're more like they want to be your buddy, and they want to be someone that you might want to have around all the time. Why leave? I'll just crash here. That kind of thing. So they want to be safe. They want to seem safe. They want to be invited back, and they want to be useful to a certain extent. And it's easy to relax regular caution. What I always tell people with the Goetia is it's safe if you follow the instructions. But as soon as you start tossing off this or tossing off that or trying to dispense with this rule or that rule, then it becomes becomes problematic. And it becomes easy to fall into that, especially if you practice Goetic magic regularly, because you do become accustomed to these spirits. You've got to get to know them a little bit. That's what makes Goetic demons specifically, and demonic entities in general, a little bit different than working with pagan gods or Hebrew angels, for example. I mean, with the model that I like to use when looking at spirits, gods, angels, whatever, is the model of a self-aware idea. We're talking about something that has no physical locale per se, but it does have a self-awareness. It is a sense of self-preservation. And I personally, and people can argue with that if they want, but I personally do believe they have an objective existence outside of us. Again, this comes from my experience. I wouldn't expect people to come to that conclusion without going through similar experiences. So, I mean, if people want to test that idea, again, I'd say the best way to test that idea would be to actually work with the Goetia and see the sense that they get out of it and what's happening in that situation. And that opens up a whole door to a slippery slope, which comes kind of back to what I was talking about before. I mean, say you have someone who accepts these ideas. Okay, demons have an objective existence. They're out there. They're doing shit, you know, aside from what we're doing, maybe. That opens the door back to where we kind of first started, when I first started talking, the idea of people trying to find meaning in suffering. The Goetia is supposed to be a tool. It's supposed to be accomplishing things, getting stuff done. And in terms of magical systems you can use, it's one of the most material, concrete tools that there are, because it generally depends on actually like doing stuff. There are certain demons that are out there mostly for information, or mostly for teaching different subjects, stuff like that. But by and large, they're there to produce particular results which are very measurable. If you want to get stuff and things, it's a good system for getting stuff and things. But the thing about these entities is, like, unlike the other forms of self-aware ideas, who are very much encapsulated in their names and their themes, you know, like if you get an angel who is, you know, the fire of God, then that sort of defines its nature. If you get a pagan god, then you know sort of what its attributes are, and as a self-aware idea, it is a composition of these ideas that we're familiar with. We kind of know what the god is there to represent. Demons work this way a lot less. In fact, although Crowley does categorize them according to planetary attributes in 777, my thinking is more that this is an indication of what the correct approach to actually conjuring that demon is, and the correct metals to be used. I don't feel like dukes, for example, have the same relationship to Venus that a Venusian angel would have, just because you're using copper seals. That's, again, my opinion. But these things tend to be very, very much personalities, very individualistic entities who aren't just some abstract idea, but you interact with them more like you would interact with a person, where they're not just like a single idea or a set of ideas combined, but they have personality, they have moods, they work in varieties of ways, and you really have to get to know them individually, which becomes, which is interesting for Thelema in a couple of ways, because, you know, in Thelema we are committed to individualism, and that's sort of the fundamental ideology behind that. So it is interesting to be able to interact with these entities in that way. It's also interesting because it becomes a little trickier in terms of testing them. I mean, Crowley always tells us we should test spirits when we're working with them. So it's easy to know if you've got a spirit who's sort of a direct manifestation of Venusian energy or Martian energy. You know what numbers to expect to see in the signs that it gives you. You know what images you might expect to see based on having memorized the columns in 777, what colors you would expect to see, stuff like that. But those things aren't as clear with Goetic demons. So with that, testing them becomes a lot more practical, which I think is very useful for people who are working in these kind of systems to get the nuts and bolts of a more practical system down. You really have to say to a demon, okay, well, like, if you expect me to believe you or you want me to do this for you, you know, I have to see some kind of result here or something like that. I personally like to ask them, I'll always throw in like a totally mundane question if it's something that they should know about anyway. Like, it's an entity that deals with, you know, combat and competition. You know, maybe I'll ask them, you know, who's going to win the baseball game tonight, because that should fall relatively